Learn all about living in Mexico City from Marco Favila in this video interview with expats in Mexico. When was the aha moment about moving to Mexico?
Well, actually, I think it was closer to, it was in the back of my mind since I was a kid, like, try to come back. And, you know, after 5 or 6 years of professional experience in New York, I started to really think about it. And then in 2014, I was given the opportunity to lead a team of like 36 American lawyers to conduct an investigation here in Mexico City. And that lasted about 1.5 years. So I got some more of that and had to go back to New York City. There were some problems with my my Mexican passport, basically bureaucracy, right? Like, sure. My father was born in a small town in the state of Mexico, and there were a few like mistakes on his birth certificate, like handwritten mistakes kind of thing. And obviously, you know, the bureaucracy made a mountain of those molehills. And so it took me, so after I came back in 2015, it took me another year or so, more than a year, to get my passport finalized, my Mexican birth certificate, and then finally another year or so to get a job.
And so what job do you have? Where do you work?
So yeah, I'm a vice president in I guess our anti-money laundering department. I think it's called monitoring risk and management.
And so you've been down there now. How long in Mexico City? This second time around?
Yeah, a bit over 3 months.
Okay. And did you end up buying a house, or you're renting an apartment or a house?
Renting an apartment.
Okay. And what section of the city?
In Polanco, in the northern part of Polanco, near the Sumaya Museum, if anyone is aware of that museum.
Where is that in relationship to the Zocalo?
Oh, it's about, I don't know, 5 miles northwest.
So it's really close to it's in the downtown area, the city center area of Mexico City.
It's very central, yes.
Yeah,
yeah,
and are you like in a high-rise apartment, or?
Yes, I'm in a high-rise apartment, you know, as part of the new developments. You know, lots of young kids here, lots of amenities, you know, a new building with like pool, gym, and all the amenities. Mm-hmm. So, you know, as I'm getting started here, it's working for me right now.
Spectacular view of the city?
Pretty good. Not to 27th floor. 27th floor, so I have a pretty good view.
How nice. Do you mind us asking how much you're paying a month for and how big your place is?
No, so I don't know in feet, but it's approximately 55 meters squared they use here, and it's about 17,000 pesos, which is, you know, $900 or something like that, USD.
So it's about 600 square feet or so for about $1,000, right?
Yeah, right. Very fair, you know, considering I'm coming off 9 years in New York City. So the smaller space doesn't necessarily bother me, and, you know, to me the cheap rent is quite nice considering the amenities.
And it's a one-bedroom apartment, I would assume.
Yes, sir.
Yeah. How far is it from your job?
Well, about 10 to 15 minutes in a Uber based on traffic. Everything, as you know, is based on traffic.
Uber is everywhere.
Correct. Yeah, and I use them mostly to get around. I also have an EcoBC membership, so I do quite a lot of biking. I also have my own personal bike, which I take out as well. So, you know, I use everything at my disposal to get around town.
There's a lot of biking in Mexico. Mexico is a very ecology-oriented country. They're still in the Paris Accords.
Yeah, for example, and they just recently initiated a full-scale like recycling program in the regular trash, like the regular garbage pickup. So yeah, in that respect, they're doing very well.
That's great. And what's a neighborhood like that you live in? Is it? I mean, how would you equate that to like New York City? Is it like the West Side or?
So it's a little bit in my immediate area. They're still doing a lot of construction of other high-rise apartment buildings. But if I walk 2 blocks, it becomes more corporate office. and there are tons of amenities. As I mentioned, the Sumaya Museum, which is I think built by Carlos Slim, and the Jumex Museum is next to it. There's also the new aquarium here. So all that was within a half-mile radius, which is quite nice. And also the Antara Mall is about a half mile away as well. So there's a lot of movement, a lot going on between the corporate offices and the fancy shopping at Antara. There's a lot of movement going on.
And I'm assuming that working for Banamex that you're fluent in Spanish?
Correct, yes.
So you grow up and learn Spanish from a very early age, I would assume.
Well, I wouldn't necessarily say that. I think I was around it, but it was never focused for my family. Their focus was the English be my primary language. And it wasn't until I was in my early teens that I really decided to do my best to perfect it or to master the language. And so since about then, I've been working on my Spanish, to varying degrees.
And you mentioned when you were 19, when you spent the year in Mexico City before you went back to the United States to finish your university studies. Did you speak Spanish pretty well at that time? Was that a good opportunity for you to learn?
At the time, it was passable. My classes were conducted in English. My girlfriend was from Canada, so there was a lot of English in my life. But by that time, 18, 19, it was passable. And it just got, I continued to work on it. I still speak with an American accent. I don't think that's going away anytime soon, but I'm comfortable in all situations. Mm-hmm. In terms of expats with more limited Spanish, I think it's still quite friendly. Almost everyone in school here learns English, and obviously the better educated Mexicans are even better in English. The Eco BC station, for example, that I mentioned earlier, has language in English, text in English. And so you'll often see the dual text of Spanish and English in lots of public spaces.
In Mexico City also, right?
I'm aware. I'm on various Facebook groups for expats. There's also the very famous Internations here, who do events fairly often. I happen to have a girlfriend since when I was living here before, who's a native, so I sort of spend a lot more time around, and I have family here, and less time actively searching other expats.
So you're really, you had mentioned that your father was raised in the state of Mexico. So do you have relatives that live actually in Mexico City?
Correct. For example, this weekend we have a birthday party to go to.
Ah, fun.
So I get to enjoy very local festivities.
Oh, that's absolutely wonderful. That's the best of all worlds. Experienced any culture shock when you finally landed full time in Mexico City?
Well, the difference this time, Robert, has been doing more. I've had to do more interactions with government processes and even Eco BC, that process. Everything's fine. Well, not everything's fine. There's a different concept of time here than before.
Everyone realizes that pretty quickly.
Yeah. The thing is, there's no sense of urgency. And again, being someone who's lived in New York City for 9 to 10 years, I'm very much someone who acts with urgency.
Yes.
So there's been that sort of clash of I'm having to work on my patience skills. But I'm coming along and doing my best.
Does your girlfriend help you out in that area?
Well, she just reminds. Well, I constantly reminded that not everyone is from New York, or not everyone. There's a different pace. But I get a little frustrated sometimes. But that's probably the biggest thing that frustrates me at this point.
Mm-hmm. What do you love about living in Mexico City?
Well, that's not easily explained. I think so much of the culture, that I love. Again, I also have this background, but anyone can love, everything from the architecture of these beautiful buildings from 500 years ago to even 200 years ago, from the beautiful architecture. It also has the most museums in the world, something like 150 or something like that of any city in the world. it's all the creature comforts of big cities in terms of world-class restaurants, and so all of that I appreciate. The warmth of the people, it's often commented on how warm Mexicans are and friendly to everyone, and much more polite. For example, every time I get into an elevator and someone else gets in, it's immediately buenos dias, buenas tardes, whereas in New York City, we pretend we don't see each other. We actively disengage.
In Mexico, everyone says buenos dias and ¿cómo está?
Exactly.
It's a whole different world in Mexico. It's a world of warmth and really caring for other people.
Exactly. And so that's another big factor that is like, oh, you know what? That's a nice way to live and to conduct yourself, So that's another part of it. But yes, the list, just goes on and on. But we'll see what happens,
What are your favorite places to go, like on weekends?
Well, I'm not sure you're aware, but they open up Reforma on Sundays and make it pedestrian for like 5 to 10 miles. Well, 5 miles approximately. So they shut it down for cars, and so you just see people running with their dogs, or bicycling with their dogs in tow, or doing it on rollerblades, and it's just a beautiful thing because Reforma is the Mexican Champs-Élysées, the beautiful boulevard. And it's quite nice to stroll on Sunday mornings.
Isn't that civilized?
Very civilized, yes. Pedestrian Sundays. It's one of my favorite things here. I'm also a big eater, so I'm constantly looking for places to eat, from taco stands to, again, some of the world-class restaurants we have here.
You really do have some world-class restaurants in Mexico City.
Yes, sir. Yes, we have one of our famous chefs here has a restaurant called Pujol, Enrique Olivera, and he also has 2 restaurants in New York City gaining increasing fame there as well. So gone international, the Mexican chefs at the highest levels.
How difficult is it moving around the city? I know you have a very well-developed subway system there, and clearly taxis and buses and so forth. Pretty easy to get around?
I wouldn't say that. I say you really have to. Some of the people here travel 1.5 hours one way to work. Some of them 2 hours one way to work. Again, this also happens in New York City, but here I think it's more common for someone to travel 2 hour one way. The traffic can be sometimes extremely discouraging. It's part of the reason why I decided to live so close, choose an apartment so close to my job. I think that would greatly diminishes the hassle of the traffic. One has to be, always keep in mind the distance and the traffic when you want to get around. In terms of the size of the city, if there's no traffic, you can cross the city probably in 40 minutes. But that's under optimal conditions. It's not that. The issue is the narrow streets and the sheer volume of vehicles.
How are you finding the cost of living there?
Again, this apartment I think is very reasonable in terms of big city living. But I always tell my friends in New York, if you go to a better restaurant, it's about 80% of what I would pay in New York. So it's not exactly free. It's not nothing, but there's a slight difference. If you really want to look for your bargains, you can find them. The subway, for example, here is about 35 cents each way, as opposed to $2.75 each way in New York City. So that's one example. Getting around, I think gasoline is cheaper here. So you can find your very cheap spots, but if you want the luxury goods, have sort of almost like a premium on them.
And you have in Mexico City probably the best shopping anywhere in the country of Mexico. Also, I'm sure that you have from Cartier and very upscale shops all the way to the big box stores, and as well as all the Mexican department stores and so forth.
Exactly. So yeah, it runs the gamut. And the same goes from grocery stores. So from fancy gourmet stores to, what I actually love as much as fancy gourmet stores, or even more, the mercados, where you can go and buy pretty much everything from fruit to vegetables, oatmeals, seeds, nuts. I mean, I think you can get almost anything at a mercado these days, and I think that is like my favorite way to grocery shop.
That's where you grocery shop most of the time?
Right, yes, that's where my preference, definitely my preference.
And that's considerably less cost than shopping in New York City?
Exactly. I mean, not only is it cost efficient, but it's also nice to get to know your local grocer in that respect. You see the same faces there, the same people there. And again, it's part of the whole community. Most of these communities, colonias, have their own mercado somewhere. And you can go there within a few, every few blocks or every mile, every neighborhood has one. And it's a great way to get to know, well, if not your neighbors, but at least the person who's selling you your chicken or the person who's,
Sure.
Yeah.
What do you think is the biggest advantage to living there?
Advantage. Oof. Well, that's a tough one. I think we get the best of both worlds. Like here, you can pretty much get everything you can get in the U.S. plus a whole another world. You can get your if you're craving your Domino's, you have your Domino's at Papa John's and then you get this whole other side of like not just street tacos but Mexican restaurants, El Bajillo, for example, and so you get everything and more here.
And what about disadvantages?
Well, in terms of, sometimes the less of a sense of urgency. So things take longer and one has to have more patience. Everyone wants 4 copies of everything to get anything done. 4 copies of your identification, 4 copies of, your birth certificate.
Marco, what advice would you give to someone thinking about becoming an expat in Mexico?
Well, you have to sort out, aside from, finding the job, doing your best to find, a job in advance, either finding work remotely that you can do from here or having your employer transfer you. I'm a very practical person in terms of getting things in order in terms of your finances, your credit cards. Make sure you have, credit cards with no foreign transaction fees. I, for example, have a debit card from Charles Schwab. That debit card, few people know this, the checking account at Charles Schwab, you can withdraw funds from an ATM without any fees whatsoever. So I can go to any ATM in Mexico or anywhere in the world, withdraw without paying a penalty for being a non-bank ATM. So that is a huge plus. Vehicles is a whole another matter. If someone wants to bring that, I have little insight to offer on that. But phone is another thing. I still have an American phone number. Almost everyone here uses WhatsApp, but I would be lying if I didn't say that it would probably be a bit more convenient to have a local phone number.
Thank you so much for your time today, and have a fantastic time enjoying Mexico City.
Thank you, Robert.